Welcome back, APUSH students. Today is Chapter 35 of the American Pageant, titled The Cold War Begins. If you don't know the American Pageant, it's fine because the content is still going to be the same. I'm going to be going over all the key terms and notes for this chapter that helped me get a 5, so I encourage you to take notes along as well. Harry Truman, president after Roosevelt's death. He was faced with the post-war challenges which made him mature as a politician and president faster. Truman was cocky and arrogant, but was authentic and solid-minded. He had no fear in assuming the numerous responsibilities in the post-war world. Truman had to deal with a lot of the early resolutions at the end of World War II and the very beginning of the Cold War. The Cold War, standoff between the United States and Russia. The tensions between the US and Russia connected to all forms of post-war reconstruction and order. Considering they are the two most powerful nations, the Cold War is also directly connected to the space race and the arms race. The tension between the two powers not only affected them, but the entire world. The most important thing with the Cold War is that it wasn't actually a war. There was no fighting. There was some proxy wars, but we'll get into that later as the chapter goes on and as the Cold War moves on. But it's really all about tension between the United States and Russia, or the Soviet Union. United Nations, Council of Major World Powers. This is not the same as the League of Nations from before, from World War I, but it's kind of similar. The UN differed from the League in which consent must be agreed upon for an action to take place on a country, making the UN more cooperative than its predecessor. The UN was almost unanimously agreed upon by the Senate. Unfortunately, the US and Soviet Union were not willing to give up the atom bomb in early UN talks, which set the stage for the arms race. So it's kind of crazy to think about that the entire Cold War and the arms race could have been stopped just by peace talks early on in the United Nations, but since that didn't happen, we have the multiple decade-long Cold War. Nuremberg trials, war crimes for Nazis. It punished top Nazis, which officially rid the German government of the Nazi Party. The trials and punishments were harsh yet necessary. These trials were the only agreements made on post-war Germany, and the Soviets and Americans differed on ideas for post-war Germany. The Nuremberg is definitely a criminal thing. You can go into the trial and look at all that stuff, but for the APUSH purposes, the Nuremberg trials and putting Nazis away in prison is more about German reconstruction and post-war reconstruction. Berlin airlift, American supplying of the Western Bloc of Berlin. Supplying runs demonstrated American persistence for controlling Germany and against the blockades and controls of Russia. After this event, Russia lifted its blockade from Berlin, and the western and eastern sides of German control were officially and clearly outlined. Berlin became a key site of the Cold War. The difference between East and West Berlin, showing the differences between the Communist Soviet Union and the capitalist United States and the rest of the West, is going to serve as a massive and really important juxtaposition between the two sides. And a lot of how the Cold War is going will be judged on how either East or West Berlin is doing. George Kennan, creator of the Containment doctrine. He was an expert on Soviet thought and ideas, and also a master diplomat, which helped to craft the Containment doctrine, giving America a plan to go after communist expansion in the Cold War. Truman adopted his ideas on being tougher and firmer with the Soviet Union. So the United States didn't want to, and they really couldn't eradicate the Soviet Union, but they wanted to try to contain the spread of communism, because they thought that the Soviet Union's ultimate goal was spreading communism throughout all of the East. And whether that's true or not, I probably is, but that's just how the United States thought. So a lot of their foreign policy was all about containing the spread of communism from the Soviet Union and moving outwards. Containment doctrine, document outlining Soviet expansion. The document sent a clear message that the US clearly and directly recognized Soviet expansion and that they were prepared to block communist ideas through fierce containment policies. This is where the idea of the proxy wars start to come in. The US will get involved in a lot of smaller wars near Russia because they think that communist regimes will uprise and then connect with the Soviet Union and therefore expand the Soviet Union, so they get involved in things like Vietnam, for example. That's a little bit down the road. Truman Doctrine, Truman's message against communism. It was a sweeping message and commitment that tied the United States with overseas affairs regarding the spread of communism. It set a precedent starting with Greece and Turkey that America would aid countries resisting communism and reverted any isolationist hope. It further divided the world into pro-America or pro-Soviet groups. So this is more of a cultural and political statement against communism, when the Containment Doctrine was more of a military strategy and foreign policy type thing. This just puts America firmly on the side of capitalist and Western ideology-centered countries against the spread of the Soviet Union. Marshall Plan, America aiding war reconstruction in Europe, similar to how they kind of got involved in World War I reconstruction, even though the isolationist stuff is definitely what caused World War II. This is a full commitment for the United States in reconstructing the world after the World War II. The idea financially tied America to the war reconstruction of various countries, but was mainly intended to stop radical governments. The US offered to help cure the post-war crisis so communist governments couldn't take over in vulnerable countries. The plan was remarkably successful in financial recovery and communist suppression. So the United States got themselves heavily involved economically to prevent the turmoil in these governments from causing them to fall and causing new regimes to come in, and they feared that communist regimes would come in and take over these poor and ravaged countries and install their regime. Henry A. Wallace, Vice President and Secretary of Commerce. He opposed Truman's policies that influenced the Cold War. His defiance of the anti-Soviet fervor eventually thrust him into a left-wing third party that pushed a presidential run. Creation of Israel. Truman agrees to recognize a Jewish state within Palestine. This is very relevant now if you're watching it in the year that this video was released, with the Israel-Palestine conflict kicking up yet again. Although much of the reason was Jewish sympathy, it was also intended to establish a pro-American government to resist Soviet influence in the Middle East. This decision troubled Arab-American relations in the future, specifically in regards to oil. So in the current modern context, America is definitely still a supporter of Israel, and that's all born from back here, where America kind of installs the Jewish state within Palestine in the Middle East. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, this is NATO, Committee of European Nations in the United States. It reversed the long trend of America staying out of foreign alliances and entanglements, remember back to World War I, or right after World War I, and tied America with European unification. NATO became the center of all Cold War policy, and in result, Cold War militarization. Mao Zedong, communist leader in China. The rise of his Communist Party and the collapse of China was a major defeat for America in the Cold War. Almost 1/4 of the world fell under communism quickly, and communism itself gained a huge geographic area. So China not really siding with the Soviet Union, but falling into the same ideology as Russia. Just those two massive land masses out in Asia really influenced how that entire hemisphere operated, with two huge powers now under communism. Soviets' 1984 A-bomb test, Soviets acquiring the atomic bomb. It struck fear in America that they no longer held the upper hand in nuclear weaponry, which removed the shaky sense of security. When Truman responded with his demands for the H-bomb and the Soviets did the same, the never-ending arms race commenced. Eventually, mutually assured destruction quells the importance of such weapons, and the use was unthinkable. So as each country becomes more technologically advanced and just gets more and more advanced weaponry, more and more powerful weaponry, eventually they become so powerful that they can't even think about using these weapons. It's unfathomable to even drop an H-bomb or anything like that on countries and areas in the world. It could potentially destroy the world. So both the United States and Soviet Union build up these massive quantities of arms that they can't really use, but all it does is ensure that either one of them can kill each other, so either one can kind of control each other. NSC 68, enactment of expanded defense spending. The Korean War all but affirmed the necessity of the spending, which led to the rapid expansion of the American military, even further than what had been seen in the World Wars. It further represented the idea of unimpeded American economic and societal expansion. So America, behind all this, was becoming a massive world superpower. They were getting involved in all these economic, political, foreign ventures, building up their military. America was becoming a superpower alongside the Soviet Union. Korean War, war over North and South Korea. It was the first armed conflict of the Cold War and what became the ever-common proxy wars. The communist North Korea, aided by the Soviets, went against the democratic South Korea, aided by America. America sent most of the supplies and men on behalf of the UN and asserted its dominance in the UN over other nations, as its generals took orders directly from the US and not the UN Security Council. So the UN tried to place itself as a sort of advisory board to proxy wars and wars that UN countries were getting involved in, but the US said, no, we're going to do it our way. And this really put themselves at the forefront of the UN and the forefront of the entire world, again following that superpower theme. But the main point of the Korean War is to show that these proxy wars started to happen, and they will continue to happen in different areas of the world. HUAC, Committee to Investigate Anti-Government Sentiment. It was a powerful committee created by the House that could go after suspected communists and could even be used to go after political opponents. It is an example of government overreach during the Cold War period. As the fear of communism grew because of the expansion of the Soviet Union and the continuance of the Cold War, there was a lot of internal conflict and internal fear during that time, and that caused some policies that were a little bit overreaching from the government to kind of spy on people and try and make sure people weren't communists, and it started this whole big thing, and it will continue to happen. The Rosenbergs, scientists accused of leaking A-bomb secrets. They were symbolic victims of the Red Scare and Red Hunting during the Cold War and created divisive opinions over the case. Although further evidence suggests they were guilty, they symbolize the extent of communist scare in the justice system. So if you were a suspected communist, the justice system would come after you, it would become a massive story, the government would crack down on you. And even though the Rosenbergs are a case where they're probably guilty, a lot of people who were innocent were affected just like the Rosenbergs were. McCarthyism, avid red hunting. These sentiments led to far-reaching and anti-communist action against people within and beyond government. It altogether heightened the fear and suspicion during the Cold War era. McCarthyism added a sense of brutality to communist witch hunts, although many people were behind his sentiments. McCarthyism wasn't just the product of one guy, it was an entire movement, particularly a very conservative movement, that went after suspected communists and suspected communist ideology inside American government and inside the American population as a whole. Army McCarthy hearings, communist hearings directed at the army. It was an overwhelming failure of McCarthyism, and it spelled the end for McCarthy's rule as a senator. More importantly, it exposed how anti-communist labeling can go too far, where it threatens the democratic system entirely, as people can be accused at will. So when McCarthy started going after people in the military and other people in government, it just was not going good for him, and the Red Scare really went well beyond its means, and that's when it started to kind of retract a little bit. People started to get a little bit fed up at the whole red hunting thing and maybe a little bit scared by it. But the fear of communism didn't stop just because the really avid and really far-reaching McCarthyism stuff was gone. Executive Order 9981 desegregated the armed forces. Not only was it an early step in the civil rights movement, it symbolized America's growth towards racial equality as a result of the necessity for foreign sympathy. It showed the importance of racial equality as a beacon to the world to side with America over the Soviet Union. So if America was trying to be this beacon of morality, they're trying to go against communism because communism suppresses rights and all that, America has to fix its own domestic and internal problems, and that starts with the civil rights movement, and it started here with desegregating the military. Taft-Hartley Act outlawed union-controlled workplaces. It slowed the initial progress that was made in the labor movement during the New Deal, as many protections for unions were lifted and they became more liable for business failures and strikes. It is a symbol of the many other stepbacks the labor movement faced after the war's end. The labor movement and labor unions were really connected to communism, and not that they shared the same ideas or shared the same sentiments, but a lot of people grouped them together politically, and that wasn't a good thing for the labor movement during the time of intense communist fear. GI Bill, welfare to returning veterans. It was a sweeping bill that provided money and education to veterans. It helped the economy by steadying the flow of employment that came into the already downturn market, which led to long-term economic expansion instead of short-term downfall. So large swaths of Americans are coming home from World War II, and they needed to get reintegrated into the economy and into the world, and the GI Bill just helped all the soldiers returning from the war to just get back to their lives. Dixiecrats, separated faction of Democrats. They separated due to racial divisions and complaints over government expansion, as they showed evidence of hard racism still existing in government. Their separation is an example of the chaos of the 1848 election and its candidates. So the Democratic Party starts to fracture a little bit as the world and the policies evolve. People who feared more government expansion inside the Democratic Party tended to shift more conservative, and they might have even joined the Republican Party. Fair deal meant to uplift poor people. It met fierce opposition due to its government spending policies, but the successful parts were minimum wage, public housing, and social security expansion. Although some reforms were struck down, the overall economic boom made up for legislative shortcomings. So this was definitely more of a liberal spending deal, but it was just meant to uplift people coming out of the war and the war-torn economy, just to help them uplift themselves and get back into their lives. Sunbelt, vast southern and western region. I think I said in another video or another chapter that this would come back. The Sunbelt becomes very important in the post-World War II and Cold War world. It expanded greatly in population at rates higher than the industrial Northeast and made California the most populated state. Its job availability and openness to prosperity made it known as the American frontier, as people poured it into the region. Its growth made it rival the North in the political sphere, as more government spending was invested into the Sunbelt. This region finally shifted political power away from the North. So the Sunbelt and into the West gained a ton of population. They gained a ton of people, a ton of jobs, a ton of manufacturing businesses, all different types of economic spheres. The Sunbelt really expanded, and even though the North has always been, since the beginning of the country, the center of economics in the United States, the Sunbelt was starting to really rival it, and they even took a lot of power away from the North. As you know, now California has the most votes in the Electoral College now This really spread the country, and now the country was really even instead of just having a ton of people in the north, and then it gets more and more disparate out as you go. Levittown, town of vast suburb construction. Its house zoning and construction plans revolutionized the way cities were built, as thousands of homes could be made in one project. Suburban developments became an extremely prosperous economic venture, and more people could move into homes due to the efficiency of household construction. Ever since the dawn of cities back in the 1800s and into the 1900s, the suburbs has also been a growing thing, but this is where the suburban phenomenon really starts to pick up as more and more housing developments start to get made, and a ton of homes are just built by one guy and one plan. And this is where you see those neighborhoods where all those houses look the same, that type of thing, if you've ever seen that. It really revolutionized how urbanization was done and how suburbanization was done. Now a ton of people were living in the suburbs. White flight, white migration to the suburbs. The generally richer white populations moving into the suburbs created geographic segregated zones between suburbs and urban cities. The emigration from urban neighborhoods by white people opened the door for more minority groups to find opportunities in urban cities. This created both a wealth gap and exacerbated segregation through public housing policy. So even though this opened some opportunities for minorities to get themselves into the cities, inner cities were particularly poor and more tumultuous to live in, and just not as good of a quality of life as if you moved into the suburbs. Baby boom, increased birth rate in the post-war period. The birth rate was so expansive that it greatly influenced demographics, and it declined every year since the boom period. It changed the economic landscape as school jobs and child products assumed a larger market. They returned the favor as consumers where fashion and music culture exploded in a youth cultural expansion. The long-term effects of the post-war generation put strains on the job market and the social security system. This is the boomer generation. A massive influx in the American population definitely had effects on the economy and all type of public spending policies. But in a time where you're recovering from war and you're trying to grow your economy, it's really great to have more people having children to just increase overall activity in the world. And that's a wrap. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next chapter, and goodbye.